Good afternoon and welcome. Our topic for the next couple lectures, lectures 5 and 6, will be the Declaration of Independence. We're going to, in lecture 5, take a look at the Declaration as an historical document. We'll talk a little bit about the context into which that document was born. In lecture 6, we're going to talk about the Declaration as a literary creation. So that's where we're headed. The story of the Declaration of Independence begins in the year 1760. 1760 is important because that's the year that George III ascends the throne of England. At that time, he is just in his early 20s, and he is third in line of a dynasty known as the Hanoverians. The Hanoverians were a bit of an odd case in British history since they weren't British at all. They were German. George III's great-grandfather, George I, was invited by Parliament to sit on the British throne after the childless Queen Anne died. Neither George I nor George II spoke English, and as a result, both of them took a very hands-off approach to running the British Empire. As a result, during the reign of George I and George II, the power of the monarchy diminished, while the power of Parliament increased. Even though he was a Hanoverian, George III was very different from his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. George III was British in his thinking. He was British in his upbringing, in his schooling. He spoke English as his first language. And most importantly, George III was determined to reverse the relationship between king and Parliament. This mindset led almost immediately to tension between the Crown and the American colonies. A second issue also contributed to the tension between England and their American colonies. That issue was the young king's insistence that the colonies pay the bulk of the cost of the 7 Years' War. Since this war was fought largely in North America, the king insisted that the colonists pay for it. To this end, he sought to tax them directly, an unprecedented move. Colonists had paid taxes to their colonial legislatures for over 150 years, so the issue of taxation is not new. But they didn't want to pay taxes to a king in a far-off capital. This is where we begin to hear cries of taxation without representation. Now, the argument that King George is going to make is, I think, a pretty good one. King George, when the cries of taxation without representation began, he says, now, wait a minute, my American colonists, you are in fact represented. In British Parliament, we have two types of representation. We have actual representation, and in that sense, you're right. There is no member who sits for any of the North American colonies who represents them directly. But there's a second kind of representation called virtual representation. And according to virtual representation, every member of Parliament sits on behalf of the whole of the British Empire. As a result, George III said to his American colonists, you are in fact represented by every single member of Parliament. Not a bad argument, I think. The years from 1760 to 1775 were a struggle between the colonists, who were determined to assert their rights as Englishmen, and their king, who sought to reassert his control over his American domains. Finally, in the summer of 1776, as we've said, 16 months into the war, the American colonies declared their independence. In July of 76, 56 representatives gathered at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. There they debated and eventually signed the Declaration, thereby officially separating the American colonies from the mother country. This famous document was written in the form of a letter of grievance to George III of England. The purpose of the document was to show that George III had become a tyrant, and that as a result, he no longer merited the loyalty of his American subjects. As a result, the largest part of this document is a list of 28 separate crimes alleged by the colonists against King George III and Parliament. Now, let's consider just a few of these crimes. I want to give you a couple examples so you understand the sorts of things that we're talking about. One of the crimes that the colonists allege against the king is the keeping of standing armies in peacetime. Well, in order to understand this charge, we have to understand the nature of 18th century warfare. In the 18th century, if there was a conflict, then an army was raised, it was uniformed, it was trained, it was fed, and it was sent off to fight. When that conflict was over, the army came home and went back to their daily lives, went back to work as farmers or blacksmiths or whatever their trade might be. There was not the notion of standing armies. Nevertheless, when the 7 Years' War is over in North America, George III does not bring his troops home. He leaves those troops in North America. He's going to argue that that's necessary because the French are always out there lurking and they may try to take back what the British have won. The colonists, I think, rightly understand that those soldiers are there to intimidate them, to bring them into line, so to speak. Now, a second crime that is alleged against the king is the quartering of troops. According to the Quartering Act, it was the responsibility of every British subject to offer food and housing to the king's soldiers. The Quartering Act also said that any structure that is necessary for the army to use can be taken by the army. So imagine a scenario where there's a knock at your door, and when you go to the door, there are British soldiers standing on your porch, and they say, by order of the king, under the authority of the Quartering Act, you have to house us and feed us. And by the way, we're commandeering that nice new barn that you built as well. All of this is legal according to the Quartering Act. And you can imagine how this must have frustrated and angered the American colonists. A third example of a crime alleged against the king is his refusal to answer what are called previous petitions for redress of grievances. The British subjects, regardless of where they lived in the British Empire, had a right to address their king and to ask that king, as father of his country, to redress certain grievances. Well, the American colonists had been asking the king to redress their grievances for some time. Probably the most prolific writer of letters to the king was Benjamin Franklin. He was constantly asking the king to redress grievances. Well, unfortunately, the young 20-something George III, when he received those letters, they didn't get much attention. They probably went in the trash. Finally, a fourth example of crimes, quote unquote, alleged against the king. That fourth example is that the king sought to tax the colonists directly. Again, there's often misunderstanding here. It's the idea that the king somehow introduces the notion of taxation at this point in history. That's not the case at all. The American colonists, as I said, had paid taxes for 150 years, but they paid them to their colonial legislatures, they paid them to their colonial capitals. That tax money stayed at home, so to speak. Now, the king is changing that relationship and he's demanding that those taxes come to London. That's seen as a crime by the colonists, and they include it in the Declaration of Independence. Now, as to the creation of the document itself, while there was a 5-man writing committee chosen from amongst the members of the Second Continental Congress, the document was largely written, as we know, by Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian. Jefferson, while one of the more quiet members of the Continental Congress, was chosen because of his facility with the pen. When I say that Jefferson was a quiet member, I mean that in the extreme. We have the minutes from the Second Continental Congress, and there's not a single recorded word that Thomas Jefferson uttered during those debates. By accounts from some of the other members, Jefferson took copious notes. He doodled quite a bit. He's going to create the great document that comes out of this Continental Congress, but he is not an active participant verbally. Jefferson had a classical education and was most able, thought the other members of this Congress, to set down their ideas in a document that anyone could read. And that's very important to this body. This is not going to be a document that's written for eggheads. This is a document that's written for the common man. They chose Jefferson because they wanted their ideas to be accessible to the world. Again, this is a very key point. It's something that separates the American founding from that of any other nation. The American founders saw their cause as universal in nature. They believed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were not just American rights, but they were universal rights endowed to every man by his Creator. This is truly a revolutionary idea. Now, because the founders viewed their cause as universal, and because they knew they would need assistance in fighting the mightiest army in the world, they sent copies of the Declaration to all corners of the earth. One of the things that really strikes me most deeply about the writing of the Declaration is the courage of the 56 men who signed the finished document. At the time the Declaration was signed, independence was anything but a foregone conclusion. We talked about this in one of our previous lectures. The British had just captured New York, and General Washington and his ragtag army were on the run. Jefferson and the other signers knew that as soon as they signed the Declaration, they would be considered traitors to the king, and they would be targets of the British Army in America. There are many anecdotes about the courage of the signers, but one of my favorites is a funny story involving a pair of very close friends, Benjamin Harrison of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Benjamin Harrison was an unusually large man for the 18th century. He was over 6 feet tall, he was over 300 pounds, big booming voice. Elbridge Gerry, his good friend, was very much the opposite. Elbridge Gerry was barely 5 feet tall and about 130 pounds. As the two were standing in line waiting to sign the Declaration of Independence, they were discussing their likely fate. They were discussing what it was going to be like to be hung by the British. It's rather pessimistic. Benjamin Harrison, in a big booming voice, so everyone in the room could hear him, said, "With me, it'll be over just like that." Because of his size, because of his girth, when they drop him, his neck will snap and it won't be that bad. It'll be over right away. Then he paused and looked at the much smaller Gerry and said, "With you, my little friend, you'll be dancing on air an hour after I'm gone." The humor in this story has an impact because of the timing. These men knew exactly what their fate would be if they put their names on that document. They realized the gravity of their actions. They knew that they would be hunted men, and they would likely die at the hands of the British. Still, in the closing line of the Declaration, these 56 men, our founders, pledged not only to each other, but to all of posterity as well, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Even before the list was published, the British marked down the name of every member of Congress suspected of having signed this treasonous document. All of them became objects of vicious manhunts. Some of them were taken. Some, like Jefferson, had narrow escapes. All who had property or families near British strongholds suffered. Now, all of the signers suffered in some way, but I want to conclude this lecture by highlighting the story of just 4 men. I think these stories represent well what these brave men gave up in order to found the country. The first of these men is a delegate by the name of Francis Lewis, delegate of New York. He saw his home plundered and his estates in what is now Harlem completely destroyed by British soldiers. Mrs. Lewis, his wife, was captured and treated by the British with great brutality. Though she was later exchanged for 2 British prisoners through the efforts of Congress, she died from the effects of her abuse. So Francis Lewis gave his wife to the cause. John Hart, delegate of New Jersey, risked his life to return home to see his dying wife. John Hart had gotten notice just days before the end of the Second Continental Congress that his wife was gravely ill, and he stayed those last couple days to put his name on the document, and then he rushed home. When he had nearly arrived at his home, Hessian soldiers rode out of the forest and rode after him, and he escaped into the woods. While his wife lay on her deathbed, those Hessians ruined his farm and wrecked his homestead. For the next several months, the 68-year-old Hart slept in caves and in the woods as he was hunted across the countryside. When at long last, emaciated by his hardship, he was able to return home, he had found that his wife had already been buried and the rest of his family was nowhere to be found. Hart never saw any of his children again. Hart died a broken man in 1779 without ever finding any of his family members. Thomas Nelson of Virginia, governor of Virginia, spent much of the war at the front in command of the Virginia military forces. During the Battle of Yorktown, the last major battle of the war, British General Cornwallis and his staff moved their headquarters into Nelson's former palatial home, into the governor's mansion. While American cannonballs were making a shambles of the town around it, the house of Governor Nelson remained untouched. As the day wore on, Nelson, watching this bombardment, amazed that his house is not sustaining any damage, Nelson turned enraged to the American gunners and said, "Why do you spare my home?" They replied, "Sir, out of respect for you." Nelson cried, "Give me the cannon." And he fired on his magnificent home himself, smashing it to bits. Nelson's sacrifice was not quite over. During the course of the war, he had raised $2 million for the revolutionary cause by pledging his own estates. When the loans came due, a newer peacetime Congress refused to honor them, and Nelson's property was forfeited. He was never reimbursed, and he died impoverished a few years later at the age of 50. Finally, the case of Abraham Clark. During the war, Clark gave 2 sons to the officer corps of the Continental Army. They were both captured and sent to the infamous British prison ship, the Jersey. You see, during the war, the British didn't build prisons for those that they had captured. They sent them to prison ships off the East Coast. And the Jersey was the worst of these ships. It was known as the Hell Ship because of the conditions experienced by the men imprisoned there. There were poor rations, unclean water, lack of medical care, and filthy conditions that led to rampant disease. Because their father had signed the Declaration, the younger Clarks were treated with a special brutality. Just 2 weeks before the end of the war, the British got a message to Abraham Clark and told him that if he would come out against the war, if he'd come out against General Washington, if he would come out against the revolution, if he would come out in favor of king and of country, they would release his sons. Abraham Clark's answer was no, and his sons died as a result of their treatment on the Jersey. The Declaration of Independence is truly a miraculous document. It marks a turning point in the history of man, and it's made by individuals like these. Thanks very much.